It was just past sunrise when I heard the banging loud, aggressive, and coming from my front door. I barely had time to pull on a shirt before the lock snapped and the door flew open. And there she was. Clipboard in one hand, walkie-talkie. In the other, HOA Karen herself, standing there like she had the authority of the entire county behind her. "You're under violation," she said, like it was a police order. "You're not supposed to be here." But what she didn't know was that this wasn't just some random lake cabinond. I wasn't just some squatter. She'd just picked the worst possible cabin on the lake to storm into, because it belonged to the one person she'd spent years avoiding. I'd come back to the cabin to get away for a bit, fix the dock, and reconnect with the quiet. But within hours, word had spread through the HOA grapevine that someone was illegally occupying Lot 12, my family's lot. Karen, fueled by control and caffeine, decided to handle it herself. No notice, no knock. Just force. I should have been surprised, but honestly, I'd heard the stories. What she didn't know was that not only was I the legal owner, I was also the one person with the power to bring everything she'd been hiding into the light. She thought she could scare me. What she didn't know was she'd just opened the door to a storm even she couldn't control. She stepped into the cabin like she had a warrant in her back pocket, scanning the place as if searching for something to use against me. "This structure has been marked as non-compliant," she snapped, ignoring the fact that the cabin had stood here for nearly 60 years long before any HOA existed in this valley. Her tone was sharp, practiced like she'd done this before, but her hands were shaking just enough to notice. That told me one thing: she wasn't as confident as she wanted everyone to believe. I leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, letting her talk. I knew the law, I knew the deed, and I knew her. Karen wasn't just a board member, she was the one name that kept popping up in complaints, late-night calls, and stories whispered between frustrated homeowners. She'd been tightening her grip on the lake community for years, writing old rules, bending new ones, and pushing out anyone who didn't play by her version of order. The truth: this wasn't about a cabin, it was about control. And Karen had no idea she'd picked the one place that had the receipts, both literal and personal. My grandfather's signature still hung on a framed document by the fireplace. Land deed, dated and sealed. And deep in a file box under the bed were letters, blueprints, and permits she'd probably hoped were long gone. She didn't know it yet. But every step she took in that cabin was one closer to exposing everything she'd tried to bury. Karen moved deeper into the cabin, her eyes scanning everything like she was looking for something specific, maybe hoping to find evidence that could justify what she'd just done. "This structure has unauthorized modifications," she muttered, tapping the wall with her pen. "Unreported use. Potential zoning violations." It was like she had a list ready, hoping one thing might stick. But the real problem wasn't the cabin. It was what she was hiding behind that clipboard. Outside, I noticed a few neighbors had started to gather near the edge of the gravel drive, whispering and watching. They weren't here to help her. Some of them had been pushed around by her, too forced to replace fences, repainted homes for color violations, even fined for having the wrong kind of mailbox. This was bigger than just me. It was about how Karen had used her HOA title like a badge of unchecked power. And that's when I realized this wasn't random. She knew exactly whose cabin this was. She remembered my name. Years ago, my father had challenged her over a lakeside development plan she tried to sneak through. He stopped it cold, and she never forgot. This morning wasn't about a violation. It was personal. I opened the drawer by the old wood stove and pulled out a thick manila folder. Every permit, every tax record, every HOA letter my family had ever received. I dropped it on the table with a dull thud. Karen flinched. She knew what was in it, and she knew what was coming. Karen stared at the folder like it might bite her. She didn't reach for it, didn't even pretend to care what was inside. "That's not relevant," she said quickly, but her voice had lost its edge. "The board has already flagged this cabin. There's nothing in those old papers that overrides current regulations." But she was sweating now. I could see it. Her act was starting to crack. I flipped the folder open, slowly laying out documents one by one across the table. Building. Permits from the 80s. A property survey with my family's name on it. Letters from the original HOA founders, none of whom were still around, but whose signatures still held weight. "You might want to rethink that," I said, "because everything you're accusing me of, already approved. And your own bylaws say prior permits stand." Her eyes darted to the door, then to the growing group of neighbors just outside the window. One of them, Mr. Ellis, held his phone up, recording everything in plain sight. Karen noticed and froze. The power she'd held for so long had always lived in quiet threats, private emails, and fear. But now it was public. She couldn't spin. This one. That's when she made one last move. She grabbed her radio and muttered into it, calling in reinforcement from the HOA patrol team, as if that meant anything legally. But she didn't know who else was already on the way. The one person who knew every inch of this land, and the only person she truly feared. Just as Karen barked something into her radio, tires crunched down the gravel path. A black SUV pulled up, familiar but unexpected. The door swung open, and out stepped none other than Judge Mary Ann Coulter. Retired now, but still known throughout the valley as the one person who kept the HOA in check before Karen slid into power. Everyone in the community respected her, but Karen feared her. The shift in Karen's face said it all. She stiffened, stepped back from the table, and suddenly fell quiet. "I was in the area," Judge Coulter said calmly, looking at me first, then at the growing crowd outside. "Saw a few messages pop up on the community page. Thought I'd come take a look for myself." Karen forced a smile. "This isn't what it looks like," she said quickly. "There's a property dispute, and I was just following protocol." "No," the judge replied, already walking past her and looking through the documents on the table. "What this looks like is an overreach." She picked up one of the permits, ran her fingers along the signature line, and nodded. "Robert Riverton," she said quietly. "Your grandfather built half this shoreline. I remember when this cabin went up, the neighbors outside began to move closer." Phones were still recording. Karen stepped aside, her hands now behind her back like she wasn't sure what to do with them. And then Judge Coulter added, almost casually, "I hope you didn't file anything without a legal hearing." Karen went pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Judge Coulter looked at her firmly, waiting for a response. "Did you submit an HOA enforcement order to the county without due process?" The judge's voice was calm, but every word landed like a gavel. Karen's eyes flicked toward the window, where half the neighborhood now stood, watching. Finally, Karen stammered, "It was just a precaution." The board agreed it wasn't personal. "It was personal," I said, stepping forward. "You broke into a cabin you knew belonged to my family. You pushed an old grudge too far. And now everyone sees it for what it is." The sheriff arrived. Minutes later, summoned quietly by a neighbor who had seen things escalating. After reviewing the damage to the door, the paperwork on the table, and hearing from Judge Coulter herself, he made it clear Karen had no legal authority to enter the property, let alone enforce anything without a court order. It was over. But just as we started to breathe, the twist came. One of the newer residents, a quiet man named Brian, stepped forward, holding a flash drive. "I've been on the HOA email list for months," he said, voice low. I backed up. "Everything, every meeting, every decision she pushed through behind closed doors. He handed it to Judge Coulter. Karen turned wide-eyed. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about years of buried decisions. The truth was finally coming to the surface. Karen didn't argue. She didn't have the words anymore. The moment Brian handed over that flash drive, the crowd outside knew something bigger had been happening behind closed doors. Judge Coulter tucked it into her coat pocket without a word, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about a broken door or one cabin. It was about a pattern, one that was finally unraveling in front of everyone. The sheriff took a full report, marked the door as unlawful entry, and warned Karen not to return to the property. The HOA board was called into emergency session that same weekend. Karen quietly resigned before the meeting even started. By Monday, her name was off the board directory, back at the cabin. I replaced the lock and finally sat down on the old porch bench, the same one my grandfather built from reclaimed pine. The lake shimmered like it always had, calm and steady. Neighbors stopped by over the next few days, not out of curiosity, but out of kindness. Mr. Ellis brought over tools. Ate made her famous peach cobbler. And Brian, he became the new face pushing for transparency on the HOA board. The cabin stayed right where it belonged. No violations. No fines. Just peace.